San Francisco, California. Late November 1965, 11:14 p.m. The air inside the dojo was thick with the scent of floor wax, stale incense, and the kind of cold sweat that only surfaces when men are waiting for a collision. This was not a tournament. There were no flashing bulbs, no trophy girls, and no reporters invited to witness what was about to unfold. The rules were absolute, whispered among the few who were granted entry. 60 seconds on the clock, no pads, no pulled punches, and absolutely no second chances. What happened in that minute was supposed to stay behind those reinforced oak doors, buried under a code of silence that the martial arts world takes to the grave. If the young man in the black tracksuit failed, his reputation in the Bay Area would be systematically dismantled. His students would vanish, his school would close, and the traditionalists who ruled the city's combat scene would ensure he was remembered as nothing more than a loud-mouthed pretender. This is the story that the old guard tried to bury for 3 decades. It began 2 weeks earlier with a handwritten letter delivered to a doorstep in Oakland, and it ended with a silence so heavy it felt like it had physical weight. I've spent 30 years covering the underground circuits, interviewing men who were in the rooms that didn't have cameras. I've heard the conflicting testimonies from aging masters who still argue over the inches and the seconds, but when you strip away the ego and the myth, you're left with the physics. You're left with the reality of 2 men standing in a 10 by 10 foot square, representing 2 completely different versions of the world. In the mid-60s, the martial arts scene in the United States wasn't the open, multidisciplined landscape we see today. It was a segregated fortress of tradition. Schools were silos. If you practiced karate, you didn't look at kung fu. If you practiced kung fu, you didn't acknowledge the existence of Western boxing. It was a world built on the rigid foundations of the way things have always been done. And then there was Bruce. To the masters in San Francisco and Oakland, Bruce Lee was the ultimate iconoclast. He was a man who viewed classical stances as organized despair. He mocked the deep, static postures of the traditionalists, calling them flowery mess and dead forms. He was teaching anyone who wanted to learn, regardless of their heritage, which was a cardinal sin in the eyes of the regional associations. But his biggest crime wasn't just his lack of respect for tradition, it was his efficiency. He claimed that a fight should be over in seconds, not minutes. He claimed that the complex katas everyone spent years mastering were actually hindering their ability to survive a real encounter. The establishment decided it was time to put him to the test. They chose their champion, a 5th-degree black belt known in the inner circles as the Iron Pillar. He was a man whose shins could crack bricks and whose reverse punch was said to have the impact of a sledgehammer. He was the immovable object of the traditional world. He didn't want a brawl. He wanted to expose a fraud. He gave Bruce exactly 1 minute to prove that his concepts of non-telegraphed movement and economy of motion could actually penetrate a hardened traditional defense. The challenge was framed as a demonstration of validity. The tribunal consisted of 5 senior black belts, men whose entire lives were built on the rigidity of the system Bruce was mocking. They sat on the periphery, their arms crossed, their faces like stone. The rule was deceptively simple. Bruce had to land 3 significant strikes against the master within 60 seconds. The master was allowed to block, parry, and counter with full force. If the clock hit 0 and the master remained uncompromised, Bruce would have to pack his bags and stop teaching in the city. The air was so still you could hear the hum of the overhead fluorescent lights. Bruce entered the room wearing a simple black tracksuit, his feet bare on the mats. He wasn't bouncing or shadowboxing. He was just breathing, slow and deep through his nose. He looked remarkably small compared to the master, who stood in a pristine white gi, his feet planted in a classic Zenkutsu-dachi stance. The master looked like a monument. Bruce looked like a man waiting for a bus. Sa's senior student, the man who would eventually leak the details of this night years later, held the stopwatch. He looked at the tribunal, then at the 2 combatants. 60 seconds, he announced. Begin. For the first 10 seconds, nothing happened. Bruce didn't rush in. He didn't throw a flurry of chain punches. He just circled. To the skeptics in the room, it looked like he was afraid. The master didn't move an inch. He stayed in his deep stance, his lead hand out, his rear hand tucked at his hip, ready to explode. He was waiting for Bruce to commit, waiting to catch him mid-lunge and end the debate with a single crushing counterpunch. The witnesses looked at each other. You could feel the doubt rising in the room. This was the famous Bruce Lee, the man who claimed he could hit you before you could blink? He was just walking. He was dancing, just as the master had predicted. The clock was ticking. 20 seconds gone. 25. The master's confidence was visible. He shifted his weight slightly, a subtle signal that he was bored. He lowered his lead hand by a fraction of an inch, a silent invitation for Bruce to try something. It was a trap, a classic lure used to bait an amateur into a disastrous mistake. And then it happened. Bruce didn't step forward. He didn't shift his hips or shoulder-load his punch. There was no tell, no wind-up, no shift in his center of gravity. One moment he was 3 feet away, and the next, his lead hand was an inch from the master's eyes. It wasn't a punch, it was a finger jab, a whip-like extension of the arm that seemed to defy the laws of human reaction time. The master didn't block. He didn't parry. He simply flinched. His eyes widened and his head jerked back as he realized he had been dead before he even saw the hand move. The iron pillar had been bypassed by a strike that moved faster than his nervous system could process. Bruce pulled the strike back as quickly as it had arrived. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He just reset his position. The silence that followed that first exchange was deafening. The senior black belts on the tribunal shifted in their seats. They had seen the speed, but they didn't want to believe it. 1 strike. But the rule was 3, and there were only 30 seconds left on the clock. The master's face, which had been a mask of stoic confidence, was now flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and rising anger. He realized he wasn't facing a dancer. He was facing something he didn't have a name for yet. He abandoned the lure. He tightened his guard. He decided that he wasn't going to wait anymore. If Bruce wanted to prove his validity, he was going to have to do it while the master was actively trying to take his head off. What happened next would be debated for the next 50 years in dojos from Oakland to Hong Kong. The master lunged forward, abandoning the static defense for a full-power reverse punch that whistled through the air. It was a strike meant to end the confrontation right then and there. But Bruce wasn't where the punch landed. He didn't block it with force. He shifted his lead foot by perhaps 2 inches, just enough to let the master's momentum carry the strike past his shoulder. In that microscopic window of time, the room saw the true difference between tradition and evolution. While the master was committed to his massive linear strike, Bruce was already inside his guard. But the clock was still ticking, and the master wasn't finished. He was a veteran of 100 matches, and his pride was now screaming louder than his training. He regained his balance and prepared for a final, desperate assault. He didn't realize that the 60 seconds weren't just a limit for Bruce. They were a countdown for the end of the old world. The stopwatch clicked. 35 seconds left. The master was no longer a statue. He was a storm of traditional strikes, his GI snapping with every explosive movement. He launched a series of high-line punches, each one backed by the full weight of his years of conditioning. To the observers, it looked like a wall of white fabric and clenched fists closing in on a target that had nowhere to go. But Bruce wasn't retreating. He was sliding. Every time the master's fist reached the space where Bruce's head had been, Bruce was an inch to the left or an inch back. He wasn't just avoiding the strikes, he was measuring them. One skeptic in the back, a senior black belt from a rival dojo, leaned forward until his chest almost touched his knees. He had come to see Bruce Lee's dancing fail. He expected to see the young iconoclast crushed by the sheer volume of the master's offense, but what he saw was a display of economy that made the master's traditional form look like it was moving in slow motion. Then came the first real shift in the air. At the 40-second mark, the master threw a roundhouse kick, a strike designed to break the lead leg of any opponent. Bruce didn't step away. He stepped in. He intercepted the master's thigh with the sole of his own lead foot, a technique known as a stop hit. It's a move that requires the timing of a surgeon. The master's momentum didn't just stop, it recoiled. He stumbled, his balance compromised for the first time in the exchange. His breath hitched, a sharp, ragged sound in the otherwise silent room. The Titan was beginning to look human. The master's face, usually a mask of stone, was now flushed a deep, angry red. He realized he was being read like an open book. Every ounce of his pride, every decade of his training, was being neutralized by a man who wasn't even using a proper stance. He abandoned the measured pace of the demonstration. He lunged forward, his eyes narrowed, throwing a flurry of strikes that were no longer about form. They were about survival. 50 seconds. 10 left on the clock. The tension in the room was so thick it felt like the oxygen had been sucked out of the dojo. The master gathered himself for one final desperate assault. He drew his rear hand back to his hip, loading the most powerful weapon in the karate arsenal, the reverse punch. It was a strike he had practiced 1,000 times a day for 20 years. It was a freight train of a punch, meant to end the debate with a single devastating impact. He stepped forward, putting every pound of his body weight into the strike. It was the moment the traditionalists had been waiting for. If this landed, Bruce Lee would be a footnote in the history of Bay Area martial arts. But Bruce didn't move his feet this time. He didn't circle. He didn't slide. He simply exhaled. As the master's fist was inches from Bruce's chest, Bruce's lead hand, which had been resting seemingly idle in the air, shot forward. It didn't travel a foot. It traveled maybe 4 inches. It was a short-range strike, a kinetic explosion fueled by the hips and the ground, delivered with the precision of a piston. The sound wasn't the sharp crack of a tournament kick. It was a dull, heavy thud like a sledgehammer hitting a side of beef. Bruce's fist connected squarely with the master's solar plexus. The master didn't fly backward. He didn't fall to the floor. He just stopped. His entire body went rigid. His eyes rolled back slightly, and his skin turned a pale, ashen gray. He couldn't breathe. The air had been vacuumed out of his lungs by a strike he hadn't even seen coming. He stood there, frozen in time, his arm still extended in a punch that had lost all its power. 60 seconds, the student with the stopwatch whispered. His voice was barely audible, trembling with a mixture of shock and disbelief. The time was up. Bruce stepped back. He didn't gloat. He didn't raise his hands in victory. He simply stood there, his breathing calm, his eyes fixed on the master. He gave a short, respectful nod of the head. Not the deep, theatrical bow of the traditionalists, but the nod of a man who had completed a difficult task and was ready to move on. The 5 senior black belts on the tribunal remained frozen in their seats. They had just seen their entire world, the world of deep stances, power loading, and invincible tradition, dissected and discarded in exactly 60 seconds. The master was still standing, clutching his chest, gasping for a breath that finally came in a long, ragged wheeze. He looked down at his own hands, then at Bruce, and for the first time that night, the arrogance was gone. It had been replaced by a haunting realization. The doors remained locked for another 10 minutes. No one spoke. There were no congratulations, no handshakes, and certainly no photos. The master eventually recovered enough to walk out, but his gait was heavy. He didn't look at the tribunal. He didn't look at his students. He just left. He would never speak of that night again, and the witnesses were bound by a code of honor that was designed to protect the dojo's prestige. But a secret like that doesn't stay buried. It leaks out in the form of whispers in the locker rooms and hushed conversations between instructors. The iron pillar had been bypassed, not by force, but by evolution. What few people realize is that this encounter changed Bruce Lee too. Even though he had won, even though he had proven his speed, he was unsatisfied. He realized that the fight had taken 60 seconds when it should have taken 6. He went back to his garage and began refining his philosophy even further, stripping away everything that was unnecessary, moving even further away from the classical mess. The problem with a night like that is that it doesn't fit into the history books. Without a camera, without a crowd, it becomes a myth. Some say the master let him in. Others say Bruce used illegal points. But the men who were in that room, the ones who saw the master's face turn grey after a 4-inch punch, they know the truth. They saw the moment the old world died. Tradition is a map of where people have been, but it is not the journey itself. It is a guide, not a cage. On that cold November night in Oakland, the invincible image of the traditional master didn't just shatter, it evaporated. Bruce Lee didn't just land 3 strikes. He proved that the human spirit cannot be standardized or locked behind oak doors. The world might still debate what happened in those 60 seconds. They might question the validity of the witnesses or the physics of the strikes. But for the man who held the stopwatch and the 5 men who sat in judgment, there was no more debate. The clock didn't run out on Bruce Lee that night. It ran out on the past, and the silence that followed was the sound of the future arriving, 1 inch at a time. The doors finally opened, but the martial arts world was never the same again. Because once you've seen the crack in the wall, you can never look at the fortress the same way. The truth was out, and it was real enough to change every man who stood in that room.